Welcome back to Stranger Stitches. We are going to unravel one of the most bizarre threads in the fabric where human behavior meets crime. I'm your host. This is my dog. And today we are embarking on the nocturnal journey into the enigmatic world of the sleepwalking defense. Okay, now I need to quit being quite so dramatic. I really have for you today a bowl of legal spaghetti that would make the most seasoned Italian nonna throw up her hands and walk away. We're talking about cases where lawyers and courts have to somehow untangle the mess of, well, Your Honor, my client was totally asleep when they committed the crime. Before we dive in, I need to give y'all the usual housekeeping. I am neither a medical nor a professional expert of any kind. I'm someone who fell down a really weird research rabbit hole, and I want to drag you in with me. This exploration offers absolutely no professional guidance. If you're having personal concerns about sleepwalking and legal defenses, please seek qualified advice. Don't call me because I'm going to tell you to go buy a new ball of yarn so you have something to work on while you're sitting in the professional offices waiting for your services. Also, take some sweet tea. It always helps. So let's talk about the sleepwalking defense, where dreams literally can become nightmares in the courtroom. We're here with somnambulism. That's a fancy word for sleepwalking, also known as automatism in legal circles. It's a rare phenomenon where people claim that they committed crime, some of them very serious, while they were completely unconscious. My research had unearthed 7 documented cases, and yes, there were a lot more. I picked these 7 because they were the ones that I could make the most complete story and had the most detail. These cases span from 1846 to 2001. Each one sitting at that same crossroads where sleep meets crime. The legal strategy is actually pretty straightforward. The defendant claims their actions were unconscious and lacked criminal intent. Basically, they're arguing that if your brain checked out for the night, you can't be held responsible for what your body decided to do without adult supervision. This started back in 1846, and trust me, it hasn't gotten much better since then. There are not enough cases, and they're far apart, so I guess not a lot gets done with it. These cases, though, absolutely require irrefutable evidence. The defendant has to prove beyond any doubt that their actions were completely involuntary. They've got to have medical documentation, sleep studies, expert testimony, the whole 9 yards. And having a history of sleepwalking incidents definitely helps the case, assuming your previous episodes involved something like wandering off and, yeah, well, let me give you some examples. Here's the thing about parasomnias. It's an umbrella term for unconscious nighttime behavior. Most time they're pretty harmless. Could be very embarrassing, but mostly harmless. Like sleep eating. You've probably discovered this one the hard way. You wake up to find your roommate or partner giving you the stink eye because apparently you turned into a midnight snack bandit. There's actually a term for this, sleep-related eating disorder. Or maybe you woke up to dirty dishes in the sink and what looks like a peanut butter and jelly massacre on your countertops, and you're thinking, did I do this? Spoiler alert, yes you did. So picture this. There is a woman on a weight loss journey, and she is giving it her all. She's getting increasingly frustrated because she knows that she's doing everything right, eating healthy, exercising, but that scale don't budge. At one point, she even reports that it went the other way and she gained a pound. So she starts thinking she's got some sort of metabolic disorder, and she goes to the doctor. Doctor does a few tests. There's nothing wrong, so what can he do? So goes to another doctor, and there's test after test. No one believes her. But finally, she gets to someone who listens, and Someone eventually suggests sleep eating. So she sets up a camera, and what does she discover? Yep, that's what's going on. She has been throwing herself a nightly all-you-can-eat buffet, all the goodies. Talk about self-sabotage on a subconscious level. But it gets weirder. How about mowing the lawn while completely unconscious? Because that's what actually happened. Now, I feel like I should mention that mowing the lawn while asleep is highly discouraged for obvious safety reasons, potential noise violations, and the very real possibility of turning your mower, your lawn, and yourself into confetti. Here's the kicker: the guy did it completely naked. Like we say in Texas, buck naked. Yeah, he was in the nude. He woke up in the morning covered in grass clippings, back in his bed, but he had a perfectly manicured yard and absolutely no memory of channeling his inner landscaper in his birthday suit. I mean, at least he was productive in his unconscious state, right? Let's get to one more example before we get to the really dark stuff. There was a guy who would get up at night, prepare elaborate meals. We're talking full courses, pro level productions. The catch: if anyone tried to interrupt his sleep cooking, he'd get violently angry. And remember this guy. Remember this one, the sleep cooker, because he's going to come up again in a much more serious context. So this brings us to the heart of today's episode: the sleepwalking defense in criminal cases. We're talking about the assertion that the defendant's actions performed in a dreamlike state were completely devoid of conscious criminal intent. I have found 7 cases. Some of them acquittals, some are convictions, and there was a lot more cases, but I used the ones that I could make the complete story out of, that had the most details. And they are totally a legal kerfuffle, because clusterfuck is too strong a word. No, no, actually it's not. These cases are absolutely a legal clusterfuck, and we're about to dive in head first into the confusing, disturbing, and frankly, sometimes unbelievable detail. Buckle up, Stitchers. We're about to explore what happens when the justice system has to decide, were they really asleep? Or is this just the most creative dog ate my homework sort of thing in legal history? All right, y'all. Let's kick off this granddaddy of all sleepwalking defenses, Massachusetts v. Tyrrell from 1846. Now, this case gets wild, and it set up a whole dang precedent for "I was asleep, Your Honor." That's defense that came later. We've got Albert Tyrrell, and bless his heart, this man was a skirt chaser. He's got himself a wife and 2 little kids back home in Weymouth, Massachusetts, but apparently that wasn't enough excitement for old Albert. No, sir. He's got a wandering eye and a broken moral compass. In 1845, Albert abandoned his family, just up and left, to chase after Maria Bickford. Maria is what they politely called a working girl in those days. But honey, she wasn't your run-of-the-mill lady of the evening. She had it going on. We're talking drop-dead gorgeous, and a client list that read like a social register. Yeah, all the wealthy gentlemen. It afforded her a personal maid, excellent wardrobe, and she wasn't about to give that up. But when Albert laid eyes on Maria, he fell for her hard, and he moved himself up to Boston to be closer to her. Maria had some feelings for Albert too, but she wasn't going to give up what she loved. Smart woman, if you ask me. Never depend on a man who's already proven he can abandon his responsibilities. These 2 lovebirds decided to live together openly, bold as brass, traveling around under fake names. Yeah, and this did not sit well with the polite society. The news rags of the day were having a field day with this scandal, and the public was, yeah, they weren't happy. But this situation went from scandalous to deadly. One night, Maria Bickford ended up murdered, and all the evidence pointed straight at Albert. We're talking a bloody razor at the scene. Albert's coat and cane were sitting there on the scene, and somebody had set suspicious fires trying to cover the tracks, including setting fire to the bed where Maria was. The brothel owner, Joel Lawrence, woke up in time to put out the flames and then went investigating and found Maria's body. Now, any reasonable person looked at this evidence and said, well, it's a wrap. String Albert up and call it a day. That's what the public thought, and they were ready to string him up themselves. But then things take another turn. Enter Rufus Choate. He's a lawyer that was a understudy of Daniel Webster. This man gets hired at the last minute and takes one look at the case and decides he's not even going to try to argue the evidence. Nope, there was just too much of it. Instead, he comes up with something nobody had ever heard in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Choate said, my client was sleepwalking. Yeah, can you imagine that being heard in the courtroom for the first time? They thought he had a whole lot of unmitigated gall. Choate argued that when you're asleep, your mind checks out completely, so anything your body does shouldn't be held against you legally. It was like saying, Your Honor, my client's brain was on vacation, and you can't hold him responsible for what his hands got up to, and you know what? It worked. The jury bought it, hook, line, and sinker. Albert Terrell walked out of that courtroom a free man. But he wasn't done being an asshole. It shows you what kind of man Albert was. After being acquitted of murder, this absolute peach of a human being had the nerve to ask Rufus Choate for half the money back. He said his innocence was so obvious that Choate's legal services were overpriced. I mean, he just got away with what may be the most creative defense in legal history, and he's out there trying to negotiate lawyer fees after the fact. Thankfully, Choate told him where he could stick that request, and Albert eventually just faded into obscurity, crawled back into whatever hole he crawled out of. But the damage was done. The case opened up a whole can of worms that lawyers are still wrestling with today. Albert Terrell was a dick and a cad, but his sleepwalking defense, that changed the game. And there's the hotel incident in Kentucky when your wake-up call goes terribly wrong. Down in Kentucky in the 1870s, Thane versus the Commonwealth. This one's a doozy and shows you how fast things get sideways when you startle the wrong sleeping person. Picture this. We've got a fella who is bone tired and been traveling for days, and he's fallen asleep in the lobby of a Kentucky hotel. And back in those days, hotel lobbies were pretty common places for folks to catch a nap. Think of a Wild West version of sleeping in an airport terminal. So here's our defendant, peacefully sleeping like a baby. Along comes a hotel porter trying to do his job. The porter gives the man a little shake on the shoulder and just a friendly, hey there, buddy, come on, your room's ready. You know, that kind of call. Let me tell you, that wake-up call went about as well as a screen door on a submarine. The man jolted awake, or did he? Drew his gun and fired 3 shots into the porter. Just bang, 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 3 shots. And here's where it gets real strange. The wounded porter is wrestling this fella to the ground. And he's doing all this while he's bleeding from gunshot wounds. And the shooter starts yelling, hoo-wee, hoo-wee, over and over again. And the folks that witnessed this said, it wasn't just your regular Yahoo, I shot somebody kind of yelling. They described it as downright otherworldly, like something you'd hear in a haunted house or from someone who wasn't quite all there. After the porter gets him pinned down, and lets him up. The shooter wanders off like nothing happened. As he's walking away, he bumps into another witness and, calm as you please, announces, "I just shot someone." Not panicked, not excited, just matter of fact, like they were commenting on the weather. When somebody told him that he'd shot the hotel porter, his whole demeanor changed. He got real sad and confused, like he was waking up from a bad dream, couldn't figure out how that nightmare had come into the real world. Well, the law being what it is, they hauled him into court, and a jury found him guilty of manslaughter. Seems pretty cut and dried, right? Wrong person, wrong time, wrong gun, case closed. But hold your horses. This is where his attorneys earned their keep. The defense appealed that conviction, saying procedural error. And wouldn't you know, they found one. Turns out the court had made a big mistake of not letting the jury hear some real important information about our shooter. It seems that this man had been sleepwalking his whole life, not just occasionally, but regularly. And on top of that, he was more sleep deprived than he had been in a long time. He had been traveling and he couldn't get no rest. The prosecution had managed to keep his medical records out of evidence in the original trial. Yeah, not fair, guys. The appellate court took one look at this and said, hold a minute, y'all can't decide whether a man was sleepwalking without knowing if he's actually a sleepwalker. Makes sense when you put it in context, huh? So they threw out that conviction and sent it back, establishing some important rules about what kind of evidence has to be allowed in sleepwalking cases. And basically they said, if you're going to claim you were asleep, the jury needs to know your sleep history and what kind of shape you were in when it happened. The case taught the legal system that you can't just ignore the medical side of sleepwalking. A person's history of parasomnia and their mental and physical state at the time are crucial pieces of the puzzle. Without that information, a jury's just shooting in the dark. And I hope you'll pardon that expression. The Texas bedroom tragedy, State versus Bradley. Now we're going back to my home of the Lone Star State, and we're in the 1920s for State versus Bradley. And folks, this has got all the ingredients of a tragedy. Paranoia, pistol, and you guessed it, a mistress, because apparently sleepwalking and adultery go together like barbecue and beer. We've got Isom Bradley, a Texas man who's got himself worked up real tight. He is convinced that somebody is out to get him. We are talking full-blown paranoia. So what does he decide to do? Any level-headed and reasonable person, when they're scared, well, obviously, you're going to decide, no, but he did, decide to sleep with a loaded pistol under your pillow while sharing a bed with their lady friend. What could possibly go wrong? Bradley later testified, and with a completely straight face, that he and his mistress were getting ready for bed. When he started getting all anxious about this enemy who had been making threats, his fear was so intense that, his best solution was to go all Wild West about it. Smart thinking, Bradley, real smart. Well, wouldn't you know, sometime during the night, our boy Isom gets startled by some noise in what he claimed was a completely unconscious state, because that's how this works apparently. He leaps out of bed and starts firing shots everywhere. And he thought that he was shooting at whatever was threatening him. When he found and reconciled himself, his quote, and I just love that phrasing, don't you? He lights up a lamp to see what the commotion's all about, and surprise of all surprises, there is his girlfriend's lifeless body at the foot of the bed. Yeah, a victim of gunshot. Bradley got convicted of the murder, which seems reasonable to most folks with functioning brain cells, but like our Kentucky friend, his conviction got reversed on appeal. The court decided the jury hadn't been properly instructed about the possibility that Bradley might have been asleep while he was busy doing his dirty work. The appeals court bought the argument that the anxiety and fear created perfect conditions for a sleepwalking episode because nothing says peaceful slumber like being scared out of your wits and sleeping with a loaded weapon, right? The next case, Bo Shears. All right, y'all. This next one is darker than a new moon, and it's very disturbing. We're talking about Staff Sergeant Willis Boshier, and this case is going to test the limits of patience and what you are willing to believe. It's New Year's Eve 1960, somewhere in England, and our boy Willis has just gotten the kind of news that would ruin everybody's holiday spirit. His leave got canceled. He was supposed to meet up with his family in Scotland to see his wife and 3 babies. Instead, he is stuck at the post, probably feeling real sorry for himself, and yeah, he was all down in it. So what does Willis do? He heads straight over to the hotel bar and drowns his sorrows, and apparently he was knocking them back pretty good. That's where he runs into a lady named Jean. She's a 20-year-old with more energy than good sense, and her friend, David Salt. Now what happens next gets real uncomfortable. Yeah, these 3 decide to continue their party back at Boshier's apartment, where Jean and David proceed to get it on. First on the living room rug, then in the bedroom, because apparently nothing says let's include the lonely soldier like having relations in his personal space. I don't know all the details that went on, one can assume. After hours of this delightful soiree, they all decide they're going to spend the night. But then David, apparently the one with the only sense of self-preservation, changes his mind and leaves, leaving Jean alone with the increasingly intoxicated combat veteran who's already having the worst New Year's of his life. Now here's where it takes a turn darker than Cajun coffee. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 a.m., Boshier claims he felt fingers clawing at his mouth. When he allegedly came to consciousness, he found himself on top of Jean, her dead body, with his hands wrapped around her neck and no memory of strangling her. Well, naturally, you won't have no memory, right? Because you're sleepwalking, and that's how this works. So you just wake up mid-murder with no recollection of the whole killing someone part. But it's interesting, and by interesting, I mean it goes batshit. What Boshier did next wasn't confused, wasn't disoriented behavior that you'd expect from someone who just woke up from sleepwalking. No. In what he described as a sort of haze, which is apparently the legal term of oopsie-daisy, he methodically began to destroy the evidence. He was very methodical. He turned into a one-man CSI cleanup crew. He cut off Jean's hair and burned it because, and I quote, hair is an identifiable feature. He gave the body a bath, y'all. He bathed her dead body and then dressed her and carefully placed her in his spare bedroom because, yeah, oh my gosh, it is a post-mortem hygiene routine. The next morning, so we're going on second day here, right? Boshier woke up all hungover, convinced that it was all literally just a vivid nightmare, and then reality comes knocking, and he opened the door to the spare bedroom and saw Jean's body on the floor. But even then, the cover-up continued. He burned her coat, removed her jewelry, and disposed of it the next day. Oh, we are going on 2 days. Yeah, definitely. The next day, he had wrapped her body in a blanket, drove it out to the countryside, and dumped it in a ditch, where some poor truck driver found it on January 3rd. Because apparently His sleepwalking episode included a masterclass in evidence disposal and body dumping. When the cops eventually caught up with him, and they did, yeah, faster than you can say prime suspect, his defense was simple. I must have been asleep. No quarrel, no argument, no advances, and certainly no desire to kill anyone. Just your garden variety unconscious strangulation followed by extensive cleanup. Here's the part that'll make you question everything you think about the justice system. An English civilian court jury deliberated for 3 hours because of, he was found not guilty by reason of automatism. 3 hours. They deliberated 3 hours to decide that a man who had strangled a young woman and spent the better part of 2 days methodically destroying evidence and disposing of a body was innocent because he was sleepwalking. Now, I'm no legal expert, but last time I checked, sleepwalking typically doesn't include advanced courses in countermeasures. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a gal with a keyboard and a microphone. Maybe they have different kind of sleep orders in England, but it raised some uncomfortable questions. Where do we draw the line between unconscious behavior and his cover-up? I mean, really? Can you still be asleep while you give someone a bath? Wouldn't the water wake you up? Or how about this? He was a veteran. He had been in the Korean War. And does that kind of trauma somehow blur the lines when you're sleeping and waking? I don't know that either. Either way, there is a truck driver out there who's probably still having real bad nightmares about that ditch. A Canadian milestone, Regina versus Parks. Hold my beer, y'all. Stitchers, whatever you're drinking, put it down because you're going to need a shot, and I'm here for that. We are talking about Regina v. Parks in 1987, and this one is going to make everything we've talked about so far look like a church picnic. This Kenneth Parks, a young Canadian man, and I kid you not, successfully convinced a jury that he drove 14 miles in his sleep, murdered his mother-in-law with a tire iron, nearly killed his father-in-law. And although he did recover, he had ongoing problems for the rest of his life. And Kenneth says he was all completely unconscious. And then what? He took himself over to the police department and turned himself in. Yeah. Now, I know what you're thinking. Same thing. Come again, run that by me one more time. Let's break it down. Honestly, if someone told me this story in a bar, I'd assume they'd been having too much happy hour. Kenneth Parks falls asleep watching TV at his home. Nothing unusual there. We've all done it. But instead of waking up with a crick in his neck and drool on his shirt, Park allegedly gets up, still asleep, walks to his car, drives 14 miles. Well, sources vary. It's between 12 and 14 miles for us Americans. Anyhow, he goes to his in-laws' house. Let me pause here just for a second. This man supposedly navigated traffic, obeying all the traffic laws, did not get pulled over, found the right house, parked his car, all while snoozing like a baby. He has a key to their house, and he also knows how to use the key. He gets out of the car, grabs the tire iron, because apparently his unconscious mind came prepared, walks into the house, lets himself in. He oh my goodness, I'm just getting all over the place. And then he proceeds to bludgeon his mother-in-law to death, nearly kill his father-in-law. I'm sorry, but are we seriously supposed to believe that this man's sleeping brain decided, you know what, tonight feels like a good night for a family visit, better bring a tire iron? But here's where it gets even more unbelievable. Yeah, he goes after all this, goes and turns himself in, covered in blood, and tells the officer on duty, I just killed someone with my bare hands. Oh my God, I killed someone. I killed 2 people. Oh my God, I killed 2 people. And he goes on to state several times that he has just killed 2 people. Just killed my mother and father-in-law. stabbed them and beat them to death, and it's all my fault. End quote. And then he claims he was still asleep during all this. Apparently, his unconscious mind not only committed the murder, but has the courtesy to go and, turn himself in and give a detailed confession. Now, do you think a reasonable person would look at that and say, well, that's the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard? And you'd be right to think that. The prosecution certainly thought so, but here's a clear motive. He had embezzled $30,000 from his employer to cover his gambling debts. Maybe he thought his in-laws would help him out. Maybe they refused. Maybe things got heated. Makes perfect sense, right? Well, some sources say that they were trying to help him out. But you know what? Nobody's made of money. And maybe they didn't have everything he needed. But no, Parks and his lawyers tell that different story. He was sleepwalking, Your Honor, the whole thing, every single bit of it. He was sleepwalking. Well, here's where I got a little bit infuriated. The defense had one piece of evidence that made everybody scratch their heads. During his alleged sleepwalking rampage, Parks had severely injured his own hands. We are talking about severed tendons, serious damage. It would have been real painful. And he seemed completely oblivious to it, didn't even notice it until it was pointed out. The defense argued that this proved he was unconscious because sleepwalkers don't feel pain the same way a awake person does. And I'll give him that much. It would be hard to fake not knowing that your hands were mangled. But come on, are we really supposed to believe that a man can sleep drive 12 to 14 miles, sleep murder two people with multiple weapons, sleep confess to the police, but somehow his unconscious mind forgot to feel pain? That's the story they're telling. Well, the jury bought it. Lock, stock, and tire iron. They acquitted him completely. Not guilty by reason of automatism. Kenneth Parks walked out of that courtroom without ever spending a single night in prison for the murders he committed. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they upheld the acquittal. Apparently, the highest court in the land agreed that it's totally plausible to commit elaborate, premeditated-looking crimes while you fast asleep. Now, everything about this case gets me, so I got to quit saying that. Parks did face consequences for the embezzlement. That money, he pled guilty to fraud and had to pay it back. So the legal system was perfectly capable of holding him accountable for stealing money while awake, but murder while allegedly asleep, well, that's a free pass. His wife, Karen, bless her, stood by him through the trial. She insisted he was a gentle giant who loved her parents and would never hurt anyone. You know what? Even she couldn't make sense of it, and later they divorced. And, I'm on her side with that. Nobody ever goes into a marriage thinking they're going to get divorced. But when somebody kills your parents, how are you going to stick that out? I don't know. Maybe she was afraid for their child. Yeah, oh, okay, I'm going to go on. And here's the kicker that ties the whole twisted story together. Remember that sleep cooking guy that I mentioned earlier? The one who would get violent if you interrupted his midnight meal prep? That's Parks's grandfather. Because apparently bizarre sleep behavior runs in the family. Yeah, it can happen, and that's the true part. It can be inherited, and it gets worse as you get older. Years later, Parks tried to run for a school board trustee position in his community, and the good people of his town basically said, hold up there, chief. We know the law, and we know the law says you're innocent, but that doesn't mean we are comfortable with you making decisions about our children's education. I can't say I blame them, because you got off with the murder, but the embezzlement and you're a trustee, we're going to take a pass. The Parks case remains one of the most controversial sleepwalking defenses in history, and honestly, it should be. Because if we're going to accept that someone can commit this level of complex, violent crime while unconscious, we might as well throw in the whole concept of personal responsibility and just bundle it up and send it out the window. But you know what? Like I said, I'm just a gal with a microphone who thinks there's a mighty fine line between sleepwalking and really, really convenient timing. There's one piece of evidence that made me wonder. That's it. He cut his own hands down to the tendon and didn't seem to notice the pain. That's the only thing that I can see in his favor. What do y'all think? Really, what do y'all think? Where do you come down on this one? Okay. I'm just, next case. Now, before y'all start thinking that claiming you were asleep and the sleepwalking is some kind of get out of jail free card, let me tell you about some cases where the juries took one look at these sleepwalking claims and says, you know what, we did not just fall off the turnip truck. These failures usually happen when evidence is pretty shaky, circumstances are more suspicious than a Southern politician, and behavior is inconsistent with sleepwalking or it's not provable. Pennsylvania versus Rickskers and the oops, I shot my wife defense. In 94, we've got Michael Rickskers trying to convince a Pennsylvania jury that he accidentally murdered his wife during a sleepwalking episode triggered by sleep apnea. Now, Rickskers told police, and with what I can imagine to be a straight face, that he woke up to find a gun in his hand and his wife bleeding in the bed next to him. His story? He must have been dreaming about an intruder breaking into their home, which led to his unconscious defense action that happened to result in his wife's death. You know, because that's totally how sleep apnea works. Now, I do have a little information about sleep apnea. You do stop breathing, and therefore the oxygen to your brain would go down, and it can be dangerous, but I never heard of anybody acting like this. 1 minute you're snoring like a freight train, and the next minute you're going Wyatt Earp. I didn't hear about it until I read this. This defense argued that his sleep apnea it somehow triggered his sleepwalking murder spree, but things got interesting even more. The prosecutors came back with a little something called a reality check. They pointed out that Rickskers had a mighty compelling motive for wanting his wife dead. She was planning to leave him. Now, ask me something. What sounds more believable to you? A man with a failing marriage kills his wife because she's about to walk out on him, or a man with sleep apnea turns into the Terminator in his sleep and accidentally murders the woman lying next to him? I'm going to leave that right there. The jury didn't need a roadmap to figure this out. It didn't take Sherlock. They found the prosecution's explanation a heck of a lot more credible than a sleep disorder made me do it defense. Rickskers got life in prison without parole, which seems okay to someone who thought a jury would buy his particular load of bull. This case shows you why sleepwalking defenses are harder to pull off than a magic trick. Without solid medical evidence and a documented history of actual sleepwalking, claiming that you were unconscious just sounds like the same kind of excuse you'd hear from a 5-year-old with crumbs on their face. So if y'all thought that was a tough case, and it was, wait until you hear about Scott Folliter in 97. This case represents what might be one of the more brutal crimes ever blamed on sleepwalking. And spoiler alert, the jury was having none of it. Folliter was described as a devout Mormon. You know, probably the tender heart that apologizes for stepping on ants. They're gentle folks. No apparent motive for violence, clean as a whistle, but one night, this supposed gentle soul stabbed his wife 44 times with a hunting knife. 44 times, y'all, and apparently that wasn't enough excitement for one evening because he dragged her body into their backyard, held her head underwater until the bubbles stopped. Now, this is rich. Folliter's defense team had the absolute audacity to claim he did all this while asleep. They argued that he had a documented history, was severely sleep deprived, and was completely unconscious during his little reign of terror. According to them, the extreme violence was just par for the course during parasomnia episodes. But here's the thing about juries. They may not have medical degrees, but they can spot fishy behavior when it's staring them in the I'm sorry, y'all, my clothes are dry. And boy, this case stunk pretty bad. First off, the crime was witnessed by a neighbor who saw the drowning and called the police. But that neighbor noticed something that's very interesting. Between the stabbing and the drowning, she saw Folliter motion for his dog to go lie down. Now, I don't know about you, but in my experience, unconscious people don't usually give obedience commands to their pets. But the real nail in the coffin, the police found the murder weapon, bloody clothing, boots, gloves, and undergarments, all carefully stuffed into a Tupperware container and hidden in his car. Because apparently, his unconscious mind not only committed the murder, but had the presence of mind to organize a tidy evidence concealment project. The jury deliberated and came back with a guilty verdict, first-degree murder. Turns out they figured that someone who's truly sleepwalking usually doesn't stop mid-rampage to give a family dog a command and then organize a cleanup. So their further reasoning was, if you can recognize your dog, why didn't you recognize your wife? California versus Reeds, the Catalina Island Butchery. We come to one of the more violent crimes that anyone has ever had the big brass balls to blame on sleepwalking. In 2001, Stephen Ritz killed his lover, Eva, during what was supposed to be a romantic getaway on Catalina Island. If y'all never been, it's beautiful. And when I say killed, I mean he turned that poor woman into something unrecognizable. We're talking about an attack so savage. Ritz smashed Eva's head with a flower pot, leaving ceramic shards embedded in her scalp. He dislocated her arm, punched her body with a plastic fork. Yes, and made punctures with a plastic fork. He fractured her wrist, ribs, jaw, facial bones, and skull. And for the grand finale, he used a pocket knife to inflict 3 deep, gaping stab wounds in the back of her neck. Well, police questioned this charming individual, and he claimed he had no memory of the attack. We see in a pattern here, but he was having flashbacks where he remembered fighting off a male intruder. And here's where it gets really special. Ritz worked as a commercial fisherman, and he helpfully informed investigators that the knife wounds on Eva's neck were nearly identical to those that a fisherman uses to kill sharks. I'm sorry, now what? Your unconscious mind somehow retained your professional fish killing techniques during a sleepwalking episode? I don't know. I ain't buying it. At trial, Ritz's parents testified that he'd been a sleepwalker since childhood, which gave the defense some medical foundation to work with. But the prosecution came back with evidence that made the whole thing look real sketchy. Turns out, Ritz had a history of violence toward Eva that included breaking into her apartment armed with a knife and threatening to gut her like a fish. Gee, where have we heard about that technique before? The jury rejected the defense faster than you can say first-degree murder and convicted him in 2004. The decision was probably influenced by his documented history of violence toward the victim and the brutality of the attack and the fact that his unconscious mind retained the fish butchering skills. But since we are onto the fact that people can do complex things while asleep, I'm not sure I would have let that one float as much as it did. These cases prove that while some juries might buy the sleepwalking defense when circumstances align just right, most folks can spot the difference between genuine unconsciousness behavior and someone trying to pull the wool. Sometimes common sense wins out over creative legal strategies, and honestly, that's probably a good thing. So, where are y'all on all this? Do you believe that a person can commit these acts while they're asleep and never wake up? How about that guy in England? Yeah, claimed his attack went on like 2 days. So there you have it, Stitchers. 7 cases spanning over 150 years, from Albert Tyrrell's scandalous acquittal to Stephen Ritz's failed fish-gutting defense. Some juries bought the sleepwalking story and others didn't, but they all show how complicated things can get when sleep meets crime. And y'all, this is enough for today. I need a nap. Sweet dreams, y'all. I see you next week.